right, good afternoon, everyone. It's exactly 12 o'clock. A warm welcome to today's live webinar. We're thrilled to have you with us for what promises to be a dynamic, engaging, and informative session. Today's topic is Discover the Profit Potential of Short-Term Rentals, what every property investor should know. And today we're diving deep into one of the most talked about and lucrative property strategies of 2025. And we're joined by three industry experts who are actively shaping the space, and I'll be introducing them to you shortly. I'm Neil Peterson. I'm your host and moderator for today. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Real Estate Investor, South Africa's leading independent property investment platform since 2007. And REI has been the go-to resource for property investors, landlords, homeowners, developers, and real estate professionals. And our mission is simple: to inform, connect, empower our audience with practical insight, expert guidance, and the tools they need to grow and succeed in the ever-evolving property market. We do this through our flagship Real Estate Investor magazine, our digital platform, rei.co.za, our weekly newsletters, webinars like this, and also our live networking events. And together we support smart decision-making and long-term wealth creation in the property sector. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. We get that asked quite a lot, and all registered attendees will receive a link to the full recording via email after the session, and it will also be available on the rei.co.za platform. Questions are welcome. You just use the Q&A box, not the chat box, on the bottom at any time during the session to submit your questions, and we'll answer as many as we can. And we'll do that at the end of the live panel discussion. Okay, so we'll deal with them right at the end. So as we move further into 2025, we've seen short-term rentals are definitely emerging as one of the most resilient, flexible, and high-return real estate strategies. And even in the face of rising interest rates, regulatory shifts, and a fast-changing travel landscape, we're seeing this movement. So whether you're a seasoned investor or exploring this model for the very first time, today's discussion will equip you with key insights, best practices, and practical takeaways. And we're joined by three leading voices in this space. First of all, I'm going to ask Robin Booth. He's a seasoned short-term rental investor and also educator, also written some books. And so, Robin, I want you to introduce yourself to the audience, give a little bit of background as to what you do to our audience today.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, great to be here. I'm sure actually many of your listeners have seen our conversations in the past. This is a hot topic. You know, I've been a real estate investor for over 2 decades now. I've done student housing, multi-lets. We currently got a development on the go in deep south of Cape Town. And I would probably say the biggest breakthrough came through the short-term letting with Airbnb. I first wanted to live for free. In other words, have Airbnb pay for all of my living and where I was actually living in the house, and then from the investing strategy. And due to many of those strategies and insights, I was the winner of the 2018 South African Investor of the Year Award, won an entrepreneurial award. So this is a hot topic. I love sharing information. I know you got some cracker questions on how do we get into this. I've talked about our online courses that people can also buy so they can learn this information firsthand. And I'm going to enjoy speaking to the colleagues on this platform as well, because we come from such diverse backgrounds. Yeah, ready to get into the deep of it.
Wonderful. Great having you, Robin. And as usual, and your input, we look forward to that. Then, of course, we've got Jacques van Emden. And Jacques is the CEO of Block, their forward-thinking urban property developer in the Western Cape. I just went to their launch last week, their 20th development. Congratulations, Jacques. Great to have you, Jacques. You want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful evening last week. Yeah, so we turned 10, so we managed to hit that pass of either a 10-year overnight failure or a 10-year overnight success. So we're very grateful to kind of have been going in the business for a decade now. Blocks, really, its focus has always been on principally residential buildings. We do quite a number of mixed-use buildings but it's mainly 10 to 15% of the building is non-residential. That's really kind of ground first and maybe a bit of the second floor. We really are focused in urban places where there's a great walkability, spaces where there's good density, good public transport options available, and places that people really want to live in a very urban way. And I suppose it's we've kind of tracked in some way the growth of Airbnb and certainly its exposure in South Africa. In 2014, when we launched our first project, no one was really looking at the Airbnb model. It was kind of something that was a myth, and you could travel, and it was very much so people's homes, that you stayed in someone's home when they were away, and that's where it garnered a lot of the popularity. And it's just been amazing to see a whole category emerge in a decade, and to be a participant in that space has been quite an experience, and actually really, really interesting. You know, it's fast moving. There's a lot of talk about regulations, about growth, about how's the best way to invest into it. And I think the whole world's getting used to a new category, and I think it's a great way to travel. I always ask people, if you rewind 10 years ago, how many people traveled with Airbnb versus today? I think it's one of the most common ways to travel that we see happening, which, it's really exciting. It's a great way to make cities and places we love more accessible and interesting.
Fantastic. Jock, great having you here today. And we got such a great combination. We got an investor, we got a developer, and lastly, we also got a property manager. So Richard, it's great to see you. Your timing is perfect. So Richard is the founder and managing director of Knox Cape Town. They're one of Cape Town's top short-term rental management companies. So you've come in at the right time, Richard, just to introduce yourself and give yourself a little bit of background of Knox as well.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for having me, Neil. I'm excited to be on board and talking about a subject I love, which is short-term rentals, specifically in Cape Town. We have been in the short-term rental game for 20 years, predating Airbnb, and have seen it change incredibly. 20 years ago, it was primarily handled by real estate agents who asked you to bring your own linen and towels along. It's now a completely different animal. Like Jacques said, it's a massive and emerging segment of the accommodation sector, both here locally as well as internationally. And we've seen it grow into a vibrant and fantastic market here in Cape Town.
Fantastic. Great having you, Richard. And I must say, your sound is 100%. We can hear you really crystal clear. So we're going to be diving into investor strategies, market opportunities, technology tools, and the practical realities of operating in this fast-moving space. So, Robin, we're going to start off with you. You're in the market, and you've also written a number of articles for Real Estate Investor, and you've also outlined how short-term rentals are always outperforming long-term rentals. Maybe you can share, what are the key factors that investors should weigh up when choosing between the two strategies, and specifically now in 2025?
So Neil, ideally in a great world, which I think a lot of people should aspire to, is you do both. And there's certain properties that lend themselves to long-term rentals and certain that lend themselves more to short-term. If you're starting from scratch, then there are definitely some considerations. If you don't have a lot of capital or affordability and you want to get into the property market, well, short-term rentals through the rental arbitrage strategy is fantastic, where you go and rent a property from a landlord and you just pay them the monthly rent, and then you list it on Airbnb and get the Airbnb income that comes in. And that, I think, is the biggest or the most effective way to get into this game and to start scaling. Because based on that, you can do a couple of those, because all you really are laying out in capital is the rental deposit, first rent, and perhaps some furniture if it's not listed furnished already. So that's the key. You can get them furnished already. And in that way, you can actually increase affordability, which will allow you to buy other properties which could be used for long-term rental, et cetera, et cetera. So if an investor really wants to scale quickly, short-term rental through rental arbitrage is the way, and then turning that into long-term rentals in other locations that might not be specific to short-term rentals. And I think then the other no-brainer for me is people who've got garden cottages, granny flats nearby, where they want a house hack. They want to bring down their monthly expenses by including some income from the granny flats and all that. And that's how I got into Airbnb. I rented out the front room of my house through a separate entrance, and just that income that we received paid for 75% of the whole year's rent for the whole house, the 4-bedroom house. So that was my first like eye opener. This, I've got to get my hands into this and figure it out. And that's how it started.
Wonderful. Thanks for setting that scene. I think it's great. We're going to probably unpack the rental arbitrage thing a little bit later. Jacques, you're a seasoned property developer. I mean, you're on 20 developments already. So how is Block adapting its projects to accommodate or attract short-term rental investors? I mean, are you designing different for this market?
Yeah, we certainly are. I think one of the benefits of moving through the growth of the last decade is we've had the opportunity to go into our buildings and see where they fail. And then as we iteratively look at doing each new project, we try and address those failure points. And then in parallel with that, we try and see what opportunities exist to make the buildings more suited to meet. And funny enough, a lot of it's in quite the boring or the functional elements. So we saw a couple of things happening in our buildings when you could have 50 or 100 apartments. It'd be amazing. You had the overnight flights land in Cape Town and you'd have, 10 people arrive at a building to check in and there'd be 30 pieces of luggage and that luggage was all strewn around the building lobby and people kind of are getting there at 9 a.m., check-ins at 2 p.m., and really looking at the mess that used to happen in those lobbies. And so it's a lot of real kind of service-orientated elements that empower the great teams that work in our hospitality industry in Cape Town. So it's stuff like luggage storage facilities, staff facilities. I think for us, it's we like to give quite a nice level of dignity in the workplace. So for us, it's around saying, where's your staff rooms? Where are the lockers? Is there a kitchenette for the people that service these buildings? Because there's quite a lot more staff involved in short-term leasing than there is in long-term leasing, especially kind of once you look to scale it. And then there's the service elements, like is your entrance beautiful? Does it start to move from a conventional apartment lobby to something that's a bit more kind of delight orientated, a bit more hospitality orientated? And I think those are some of the functional pieces. And then really it's trying to find how we can make sure that the common facilities speak to what's demanded the most. We typically look at kind of places to watch the sunset. We look at got to have pools to swim. We can have gym facilities, and we've seen some growing trends post-COVID for micro office pods and meeting rooms. Just so many weird things we picked up. We had customers that were in the US where one of the partners wanted to be in the apartment and then someone else was on US time zooming into meetings in an office pod in the building, just so that you didn't have to like be in a 1-bedroom with someone else on a meeting and you had to walk around all like shush. You actually could like separate and have that kind of dynamism. But I think for me, it's how do we make these modern buildings meet modern living requirements? And so it's a lot more dynamic input we've got to get into the functional design parts of the building.
Okay, interesting. So, Richard, with Knox managing short-term rentals across Cape Town, I know your focus is mainly in the Atlantic Seaboard, Camps Bay, that sort of area, but what patterns are you seeing in terms of guest preferences and booking behavior that investors should be paying attention to?
Look, I very much echo what Jacques said there. One of the specific points was talking around the need for a workspace. So that was something that absolutely was not a consideration in any way, shape, manner, or form when we got into the business 20 years ago. Now, post-COVID especially, people are recognizing that they're able to work quite effectively remotely. And as a long-haul destination, it makes perfect sense for someone to, instead of coming out for 1 week, they're coming out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but spending a fair bit of time in Cape Town still working. So we're finding that workspace requirement, having a desk, having a quiet space, having good internet connection has become a very high priority. There's some interesting niches, where we have guests coming out from the Middle East where their hygiene requirements are different. So if you're looking at that niche, things like bidets can actually be a big difference in a premium villa with guests who have got a lot of money to spend, but are looking for something that's very specific and not very ordinary from a Cape Town perspective. But I'd really say probably the biggest shift that I've seen over the course of our time in the market has been away from a seasonal peak to a much, much broader time period. We now have consistent guests checking in 365 days a year. It used to be very much a seasonal business. And although the income is still skewed seasonally, we still probably look at about 70% of our revenue over the summer months. We are getting good occupancy throughout the winter. We're seeing these micro peaks. We have a strong demand driven out of the Middle East over the winter months. Americans are predominantly traveling over their summer holidays, which is our winter months. And then there's all of the kind of meetings and incentives. You have these peaks and associated with events happening in Cape Town. So we're seeing really, I guess I would say, a nice filling out of the demand curve over the course of the entire year.
Well, that's wonderful. I think that's music to any investors' ears over there. They're looking at that to say, that's great. We've got a longer season. So that's fantastic. Well, that's really good. So, Robert, let's just elaborate a little bit on the rental arbitrage thing, because you did open up with that, and it's making a comeback, it seems, in 2025. So just share a little bit more about it, because immediately somebody would say, well, there's got to be rules, regulations controlling this. What are the biggest mistakes that you're seeing new arbitrage investors make, and how can they avoid them?
So the really key dynamic for rental arbitrage is going to be your systems, and creating or implementing effective systems, whether you've copied them from someone else or learned them from someone else. It's going to be in how to make sure that you listed first, that you get good reviews, and to make that structure work. So that means that in rental arbitrage, the first thing, the obstacle you overcome, is your communication with the landlord. You need to convince the landlord that you are going to be their best tenant, because in theory, you are that landlord's long-term tenant, because you're just then going to sublet this on Airbnb. So your ability to share with that landlord why it's in his or her best interest that you take this property over is going to be key. And there are specific points that if you highlight those, the landlord's eyes open up like this, and they go like, this is a no-brainer, please take my property, and yes, you can put it on Airbnb. The second thing that they may not quite understand is that it requires an on-the-eye approach, whereas long-term rental, you can often get away with time delays. If a tenant asks you for something that's wrong or plumbing to be done, you can do it in 4 or 5 days. But if you don't have your ducks in a row and are able to resolve problems and challenges quickly, and that can still be outsourced to a team, then you're also going to be set up for a miscalculation. Is this the best thing to put in place? And then I think the third one, which we might open up later, is just really understanding what's going to make your place stand out from someone else. And that is going to be how you choose the place where you want to do rental arbitrage, because there's a lot of supply out there at the moment. And being able to pinpoint what are the characteristics that are going to enable you to differentiate will mean you'll definitely increase your yields, and you're going to make that work. And that's all knowledge and experience, which is fantastic. It's not luck. There's very little luck in this game if you know what you're doing. And I think for an aspiring investor out there, as always, get educated, get those skills, and then you'll just see it unfold way easier than if you're just going to wing it and hope that it works.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. And so, Jock, coming back to you, I mean, we're seeing construction and borrowing costs are rising, but hopefully interest rates will drop tomorrow. We all, hold thumbs for that one. But how do you assess short-term rental profitability? Do you, in your developments, and are returns still viable that are entering now? Because, we've certainly seen there's been price hike, and you also operating sort of Sea Point area, and I know just the Waterkant centre of Cape Town, so in really prime areas. So can you maybe share, are they viable for investors entering now? Is there still opportunity?
Well, I think maybe kind of before we speak about if there's opportunity now, we'll speak about the last few years, where we kind of go back to 2021 with the rapid interest rate increase, and we looked at that massive impact on construction costs. I think there was mid-2021, diesel rose from 15 Rand to 25 Rand a litre, which is a huge on cost, on your ability to deliver a product, because you're using diesel on site, you use diesel to get things to site, staff use diesel to get to work, steel went through the roof. So there was a very big spike in interest costs as well as construction costs in that period. And they stand somewhat non-correlated to what's happening in the tourism industry or kind of the short-term leasing industry. So we had quite a lot of costs that were really hard for us to grapple with. But I think where the short-term leasing industry was able to accommodate is we saw fantastic growth in the return of domestic tourism in Cape Town, as well as the return of international tourism coming to Cape Town post the COVID interruption. So what we really saw was that the growth was outperforming the increase in the construction costs and the interest costs, certainly in 2022 and 2023. I think what we have seen is that the growth is still there within the market segment, but it's slowed to a more manageable rate over the kind of these big, massive gains that we saw of 30% year-on-year increases that we got in 22 and 23. And also in 24 was quite a strong year as well. So for us internally, we don't really see them as correlated with one another. And I think we've been very lucky in our own business of bringing new product to market that we've had growth in the revenue side whilst we've had growth in the input costs. And then for us, yeah, it's a very important part of our business. We sell about 50-50 between property investors versus owner-occupiers, and owner-occupiers is a very big umbrella. You know, it's the Joe Burgers that are coming here for work or for holidays, or someone sending their kid to, you know, the City Bowl or the Atlantic Seaboard that looking to study here, to people that are moving down and kind of following this immigration trend. But within our investor side, it's something we track quite carefully. And what we're certainly seeing is the returns are still there because, again, it's a function of the demand in the market. And what is really important to convey is that how hard it is to bring new supply in the construction industry. I mean, we know that what's well publicized in South Africa is the housing shortage, and I think it is a really pernickety difficult problem because building buildings is hard work. Building a home is traumatizing for most people, but building substantial stock and actually really making a dent into the supply of housing is really hard. And I think we track the data quite well. We've seen in the Atlantic Seaboard, they're adding about 250 units a year on average for the past 4 years, which is not a lot of units of absolute numbers. And the CBD's been doing about 500 units per year. So you're not talking massive absolute numbers when you put that against domestic tourism and global tourism numbers. And that is, again, it just speaks to how hard it is to bring stock. It's not as though they aren't, our business and many of our competitor sets and new entrants into the market, they're trying to bring stock to the market. But I think that's what will keep it still viable, is that the demand is currently outpacing the ability for developers to bring supply.
Absolutely. And also you have to look at pricing offshore. If you look at pricing in the UK, cities like New York, London, etc., we can carry on, Barcelona, all these different places, we're going to start seeing that the pricing is not comparative for what you're getting in South Africa. So there's good value here in South Africa.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the funny things, we haven't seen and I mean, Richard, you might know a little bit from the sales side in your business as well. We don't really see the how cheap South Africa is drive foreigners investing or not. What we see, it's about the confidence in the country. And I think that for me, we need to disassociate that, okay, well, the Rand's jumped by 15%. So gosh, this mansion is now 15% cheaper, and it was a really, really, really cheap. But the people are really kind of, when we looked at, let's say, 2018, 19 peak, land expropriation, people were going to come into Constantia and take away your wine farm, or they were going to come to Camps Bay and hook your villa. And that kind of, that's how the press kind of sensationalizes it. And it's really hard to convey a more balanced message. And as we've moved away from that rhetoric, and as there's been more confidence in South Africa, we're seeing foreigners look at us, which is wonderful, because they bring a lot of equity and a lot of hard currency money into the country, and they can really drive a lot of economic output.
Absolutely. No, good. I think well said there. So I think, Robin, I want to bring you in now. No, I want to bring you first, Richard, because Richard, you're doing a very important service. I mean, you're managing landlords' properties, bringing in short-term rentals. You spoke nicely about the trends and all the seasons. So if we start looking at, profit margins, after fees, maintenance, management costs, is that something, is that something that's important? I mean, certainly for some landlords, you certainly at the high end of the market, so it might be different. But maybe you could just share, what are the short-term rentals generating? There's got to be profit. I mean, it's some of the rental rates that are. Do you want to maybe just elaborate a little bit on those kind of returns?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think what Robin said at the beginning is true. Not all properties make good short-term rental properties. Our cost basis is high, and typically a short-term rental is going to cost you far more to operate than any type of long-term rental. You've got the furnishing, you've got the wear and tear on the furnishing, but you're also paying for all of the utilities. You're paying for your DSTV connections or your high-speed internet. You're doing servicing, whether it's being done on a daily basis or just on arrival or departure. And it's a huge cost burden, right? So for a short-term rental property to derive a good yield, it really has to generate a decent amount of income. And not all properties are suited to that. So I think what we see is that a great short-term rental property still delivers an exceptional return, but it's very different to the long-term rentals. Typically, if I've got a 100 square meter, 2-bedroom apartment, and I'm comparing two that are in town, the finishes and the location to some extent are going to make a difference, but there's a lot more comparability between those two. Whereas in short-term rentals, your returns are a lagging indicator on guest satisfaction, essentially. It's an occupancy game. Your rate makes a difference, but really it's about how many of the 365 nights a day, 365 nights a year can you fill? And the occupancy is a much bigger lever on your returns than any daily rate. And it really comes down to how satisfied are the guests with your product. With that being said, I think on a gross basis, what you can look at typically, it does depend whether you're managing the property yourself or if you've got a manager. But the typical management rate is, if you're getting a professional manager to handle it, is about 25%. This is obviously after the commissions that have been taken from the channels. And all in, you're probably looking at about 50%, 40 to 50% of your revenue will be absorbed by the running costs of the properties.
Wow. Okay, just I think nicely put there. And I think it's important also to talk about the location that you do operate in as well. I mean, you predominantly in the Atlantic seaboard stretching, I would say, the CBD of Cape Town. Do you want to maybe just share that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our operating area is from the waterfront through to Hout Bay, and it includes the CBD. So primarily, Camps Bays are that stretch of Atlantic seaboard coastline from the waterfront down through Mully Point, Sea Point, onto Clifton and Camps Bay. That is where the majority of our properties are. Obviously, it's a high value segment. Yeah. We tend to operate in what the international market refers to as vacation rentals. There's essentially quite a large distinction in the kind of global vacation rental industry where they talk about urban rentals versus vacation rentals. Vacation rentals are typically leisure properties individually marketed, whereas urban rentals is a lot more of what Block are doing with their Block Stay product, where it's essentially to some extent an apart hotel. You've got more commoditized units within the units. Can be a fantastic product, but it's got more in common with a hotel than the vacation rental, where it's the individual units.
Okay, excellent. So Robin, if we look, and Jock actually brought it up where he said South Africa, people see the value in South Africa. Actually, you see it in the Western Cape, I would say, more than the rest of South Africa at the moment. But I would say, Robin, from Cape Town, and where are the sort of the hotspots? Because Cape Town Western Cape is certainly a hotspot. And there's other South African hotspots, certainly, which I think are also lucrative. But what other hidden gem markets do you believe are flying under the radar for short-term rental success as an investor yourself?
So I just want to add into Richard's comment around the yield. So definitely in my case, we're getting 12 to 15% net yields after 100% finance and all running costs. So let me put it this way. That's a cash on cash. And if we had finance, we'd still therefore get profit on 100% finance of the property. So for me, that classic example of getting a property for free where all my costs and financial interest costs are being paid is what is my criteria. And that's what I'm getting in Cape Town and in some other areas, which we'll highlight now. So, compared to long-term rentals in Cape Town, for me, there's no ways I can buy beachfront penthouse apartments and have all finance and all running costs paid by the short-term rental process. It astounds me that I can own these penthouses in a way which I could never have done 5 or 10 years ago if I was just doing short-term rental. I'll just be bleeding money paying for levies and bond costs, which then brings us to, well, where else are those hidden gems? And I think more importantly than just understanding the hidden gem aspect is understanding in the absence of value, in the absence of perceived value, people are going to default to choosing on price alone. In other words, which unit has the cheapest price in Airbnb? So we have to demonstrate value as hosts. Otherwise, people are just going to choose which is the cheapest. Even if it's 50 Rand cheaper, they'll choose the one next door, regardless if it actually is better value or not. So taking that into account, definitely the trends are the garden route. And here's another one for you, an actual stat. One of my rental units in Knysna, I do the rental arbitrage in that unit, 18,000 Rand per month. And just for the December period, just for that 1 month, was 130,000 Rand gross income. I mean, that's just phenomenal. So that's a 7 times fold. I paid the landlord 18,000 Rand and I got 130 just from that December 15 to January 15 period. So just again, astounding in that high season. So then we look at, well, where else are there such things as high seasons? We certainly know Durban has multiple peaks because winter is cold in South Africa, but Durban is in South Africa. It's still a lot warmer there. So a lot of my clients who are doing Airbnb are seeing in that Umhlanga and obviously the KZN area, a lot of domestic vacation as they head down to the warmer coast areas. And then we're seeing a lot, up north and people wanting to get away. This concept Richard was talking about, of actually, having the vacation, wanting to get away for a bit. We're seeing a definite increase in that. And I think people are going to, focus on that. And what was brought up earlier, and I think maybe it was Jacques who mentioned it, over 28% of current Airbnb bookings are for 28 days or more, which means we've got this digital nomads who are staying in certain areas for long periods of time. And we're seeing a definite increase in the different areas as people are saying, well, I'm going to go stay somewhere for a month and I'm going to work from there and do that. So any place where someone can go, good internet, have good views, access to restaurants and all that, we've definitely seen a major increase. The one area where I would caution is just because it's a good holiday resort doesn't mean there's going to be a good Airbnb or short-term rental place to invest in, because a lot of previous investors in South Africa have their second holiday home. You remember this, like, yes, I've got my main house in Cape Town and we've got a holiday home somewhere else. So they are flogging those properties on the market because it's vacant in any case. So let's just drop our prices. They're not investments. So you're competing against really low pricing, but it's not necessarily a good product because the furniture often isn't very good. It's just like this beach house where the landlord or the owner isn't really looking after it. The service is poor. So just to be cautious, just because it's a good vacation resort doesn't mean that it's going to be a good Airbnb resort. And you're then competing against that mom and pop. Well, I've got a second home and I'll just put it on Airbnb. And, it's difficult to compete against that on price alone.
Okay, great. I think thanks for that. I'm going to bring in Jacques now because Jacques, obviously your developments are predominantly also in the Western Cape and they're also in sort of prime areas over there. And you did share a little bit earlier in terms of like the amenities and that kind of stuff, which is important for somebody in the short-term rental, office pods, etc., and that kind of thing. But how important is it for short-term rental hosts to professionalize their approach? And how can you contribute to that? Well, you've shared that a little bit, but how does that look more in sort of practical terms, just given what I think what Robin has shared with us as well?
I think there's, Richard spoke about it earlier, there's different types of markets and each of them have different requirements. I know some of the luxury villas, you can get bartenders kind of coming in for the evening, you can get chefs coming in. And so there's kind of a spectrum and you've got to know what your customer is that you're facing and how do you appeal to that. And I think Robin also spoke about giving value to that customer. So for us, I think as a developer, what we really look at within our segment, which is the urban kind of whether they're coming for a day, a month, or a year, we find that we're trying to figure out is what makes their lives more convenient. How do we, and then we try and say, okay, well, the short-term leasing operators need to deliver on that. And then how do we give that infrastructure to the short-term leasing operators? And it's amazing. It's down to like really silly things. What's your internet infrastructure looking like? What's your backup power looking like for that? How's your security and access control systems? How do they feel about, kind of bringing other people to their property? How does that work? And what is the, certainly in South Africa, even though we develop in very popular areas, how's your security infrastructure? How does that work? How do people feel safe? So I think that's a lot of what we try and bring on the development side into the business and support our category. And a big part of ours is about trying to feel part of a community. I think one of the key aspects that people are looking at when they look at our buildings and our product is visiting some really of the most famous suburbs in Cape Town, whether that's going up and down Bree Street or being by the Company Gardens or the Promenade or kind of Signal Hill and Lions Head. So how do we make sure that they can integrate into that? And for us, that's around really high quality, retail options on ground floor. And a lot of what an urban traveler is looking for is to try and feel local. You don't want to go when you want to go experience, Athens or Paris or Buenos Aires or whatever it is. You're trying to figure out, how do I find my local coffee shop? Where do the other people go, and how do I interact with them? And so I think that's a lot of what we try and build into the buildings as well, is that you learn that it's feeling more part of the community versus feeling distant from the community. And that's a big thing that we try and do.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I just want to, I'm glad to see that there's a lot of questions which are coming on and being answered, but we will deal with them at the end. And I know, thanks also for responding there, Richard, and what have you. So we will get to them at the end. We like to deal with them on a Q&A, but let's get, let's talk a little bit about, and I want to bring in you here, Richard. Platforms like Airbnb, Booking.com are offering co-host tools. AI-driven pricing, guest review summaries, etc. Can you maybe share which tools have had the most impact on your ability to deliver results for property owners? And I think maybe, Robin, that's also a question for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think, especially in relation to the question you asked Robin earlier about where does one invest? I think one of the most core things about short-term rentals is that the operations really matter. If you see long-term potential to be renting out in Pretoria, it's simple. You purchase a property, you find an estate agent, they list it, they'll find you a long-term tenant. But with short-term rentals, you're either doing the work yourself or you're finding a partner who can deliver the service to your guests. And that is the kind of primary determinant around the success of the investment. Yes, the location matters. Absolutely, the view matters. All of those things matter. But I can give you the most beautiful apartment with fantastic views, incredible images. And if it's managed poorly, you're going to get terrible reviews and your income's not going to be there, right? So in terms of the co-hosting is an absolutely core component, or your own hosting is a core component. In terms of the tools that we're using, there's a plethora of tools. It's a very tech-heavy business, and in order certainly to run an operation like ours, where we have multiple properties, the technology layer becomes incredibly important. From an investor perspective, what I would say, one of the core things to look at is revenue management. A revenue management tool, and a good revenue management tool is something that's really good at being able to optimize your pricing, to maximize your occupancy, to ensure that you're selling the property at a high enough rate when demand is high, and at a low enough rate to get your occupancy during the quiet times. So certainly a good revenue management tool is good. Airbnb obviously has its own smart pricing. But to be honest, I don't necessarily think their interests are fully aligned with the property owners, because they just want the rental to come on their platform. So I think their smart pricing is a little bit too aggressive. There's quite a few options for off-the-shelf property revenue management softwares out there. And what I would say is, beyond that, actually having a full integrated system, a property management system that distributes your properties out onto all the different platforms. That's a key component. It's called a channel manager. One of the real challenges is ensuring that you don't create double bookings. So as property managers, as investors, we want as much distribution as possible. You want to be listed onto booking.com and other websites. You want to be dealing with Booking, with Airbnb, etc. But the only way to be able to effectively manage that is through a property management system. It's simple if you only want to be on Airbnb, and you can derive a good yield off of being on purely Airbnb. But what we found is it's preferable to try and expand that, to get listings onto multiple other platforms, to really be able to get that extra 10% of revenue out. Besides that, tools that we've had good usage of, noise monitoring. So we put noise monitoring into all of our properties. Obviously, our properties are located in residential areas. They are high value assets. And there's two things there. One is protecting the owner's asset, and two is protecting the relationship with the neighbors. One of the key downsides of short-term rentals is that it can have a negative impact on neighbors. I think most people would prefer to have permanent residents on either side of them. Short-term rentals can create a challenge, and what we try to do is ensure that there's minimal impact. What the monitors now do, they're not just noise monitors, they actually track the number of devices that are within a vicinity, and they give us an early warning system where we can see, hang on, something's not going right, there's too much noise or there's too many devices at this property, and it enables us to proactively respond and stop something happening rather than reactively dealing with things after the fact. Guest vetting systems, that's another thing. So we saw quite a large change in the short-term rentals environment around COVID, where suddenly the post-COVID, we had a very, very different category of guests, and we ended up having quite a lot of issues. And with that, we brought in some guest vetting and guest insurance systems that helped us really ensure that we're only getting the best clients into the properties and weeding out any bad elements. But really, I'd say that the core thing to look at is, what is a good property management system? Because typically, the property management system is the platform which all of these other tools plug into. And you would have, a revenue management system that plugs into that. And all of the other tools are really predicated on that decision of which property management system do I use. That defines which channels you can publish your properties to and which other secondary tools you can plug into it.
Great, thanks for that. I think that's very important, all those things you've raised, and noise levels. Well, we need to talk about that. So Robin, I want to bring you in. Just want to add to that, but I think I want to also pivot towards regulation. And I know that Richard would like to certainly comment on that, certainly regulation. There's also been a question as well from one of our attendees now. So it's always a concern for short-term rental investors. How should investors stay compliant and still maximize returns in a tightening regulatory environment? And predictions, and I know, Richard, you would like to also contribute to that. And I know you formed Sastra. We'll talk about Sastra. And I see you responded there. We've got Miguel Martins also online who's involved with Sastra. So, Robin, your comments around that, around regulation, and maybe just an extension of what Richard said as well.
Yeah, I think I definitely will leave the specifics about the regulations that may come up to Richard. But from my side, I'm an investor. So in any investment, I'm going to look at all the different possible scenarios, and I'm going to make sure I'm mitigating as much risk as possible. And this is just another one of those investments. It's just another category. The same as if I was going to buy a long-term leasing property somewhere and I've got an encroaching township, I'm going to look at my different scenarios. It's the same thing. There could be, well, what happens if this township comes closer? What's my option then? And short-term rental is exactly the same. When I'm buying in for short-term rental, I'm looking at plan A, plan B, and plan C. If the regulations come in and they restrict the number of nights that I can have my Airbnb open, then can I still sell and not lose money? Or can I actually have made money? So my initial purchase of all my properties are good properties that with just some of those renovations, I could actually make money if regulations prevent me. It's the same thing as I might buy in a building where the body corporate says I can do Airbnb, and then 2 years later, the body corporate chooses not to. That's the same form of regulation, but localized just within that building itself. So what is my risk mitigation process there? So for whatever, as it unfolds, I'm an investor at heart, which is I'm always going to look at what is the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, how do I get out of that? And of course, in the most likely scenario, which is the one that we're in at the moment. And so far, that has just proven incredibly fruitful for me, and I'll still keep implementing that. Of course, if you're doing rental arbitrage, you've got so little risk, because if regulations do come down the line, you're just renting from a landlord. So you can therefore terminate the lease early. And if you do terminate the lease early, I always have a clause in my leases which say, in the event that myself as the tenant wish to terminate this lease early, and that I can find a subsequent tenant, long-term tenant, to take over my lease, then there are no penalties for early termination to me, because the landlord is not losing any income. And then I can just exit. So again, risk mitigation, it's true investing principles.
Okay, great. Before I bring you in, Richard, just to comment on the whole Sastra thing, I want to ask Jock, just from a property development angle, do you see short-term rentals as a long-term sustainable investment model, or is this maybe a trend that could slow down?
I think it's here to stay in my view, and I think more than that, I think it's going to grow. I think it's amazing to see Booking.com, which is a huge organization. It's multiple times larger than Airbnb. It's just, I suppose, less prevalent in most of our experiences. They've pivoted into looking at stays, and that kind of representing giving people that manage properties the ability, properties for short term, managed through their services. You're looking at many of the hotel brands actually starting to do partnerships. I mean, Marriott Group is doing it, many of them, because it's really talking to what consumers are doing. This is it was someone did a great, brilliant, innovative idea. It's obviously got legs because consumers keep choosing it. And so I think I can't see anything that is going to shift a consumer who's, someone from the Middle East coming in May, June to escape the heat in the Middle East, renting a gorgeous, unit from Richard in Camps Bay. That's a customer making a decision. And I think that, and again, within the realm of regulations, etc., I think there's such momentum and such a groundswell around this type of traveling. And this way, whether it's, kind of what Robin was speaking to earlier, the co-working, the digital nomads that are what's going to stop those trends? So I just can't see the consumers that are actually buying this product changing those buying patterns. In the absence of something new, maybe they might change, but certainly they're not regressing into old product sets. So for me, I think it's here to stay. I think the real piece is around how to figure out how to make these things coexist well. I know both Richard and Robin spoke about body corporates and how we live together. It's the Sectional Title Act is very new law in South Africa, where we prefer housing estates where everyone has their own earth, and we can all control our own fiefdom. But I think certainly in the urban spaces and sharing with neighbors and getting sound systems and early warnings and trying to make sure you got concierges and it's run well, we still want to be good neighbors. We don't want to change how we live together. And I think that's where a lot of the growth has to happen, is how we actually operate these things in a way that's beneficial for the investors, but it's also beneficial for the buildings or the areas where these units are being let out as well.
Yeah, excellent. All good news for investors. That's fantastic. So Richard, I want to bring you in here again, just to extend on, the compliancy issue, but also more importantly, maybe tell us a little bit about Sastra and why Sastra was formed. I know there has been sort of a response online for that, but maybe just in the background, because I think it's important from the whole regulatory thing that there's almost an anticipation. Regulations are going to come. We heard Jordan Hill-Lewis saying he's going to implement. It hasn't been implemented yet. So maybe just talk a little bit about that, particularly in the Western Cape.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's two things that people talk about when they talk about this potential Airbnb regulation. So on the one side, you've got what Jordan Hill-Lewis said, which was about there being a level playing field. I know that the city of Cape Town is very much in favor of Airbnb and in promoting tourism generally. But I believe and I expect that there will be a re-rating of permanent short-term rental properties in due course, because currently short-term rentals are paying residential rates. And I expect, or I believe that there's probably going to be a move to have commercial rates levied on properties that are rented out on a short-term rental basis 365 days a year. So that's my understanding from the city side. From the national side, the Department of Tourism has spoken about the Tourism Amendment Bill, I believe is the name. And within that, there is a one-line reference to short-term rentals. Very, very little of substance there. Obviously, internationally, we've seen short-term rental regulations handled in a number of ways, but in some markets, it's been implemented incredibly badly and absolutely killed the ecosystem. If you take a look at New York City, or people are aware of what's happening in London and various other locales internationally, there have been various 30-day caps which have been implemented, things like that, or outright banning. And that reference within the Tourism Amendment Bill obviously ruffled a lot of feathers, got a lot of people very concerned. Now, the one thing that the short-term rental industry is incredibly distributed. There are no Marriott's or Southern Suns or anything like that in our short-term rental industry. There's small companies like mine and hundreds and thousands of individual property owners who are managing their own properties, and maybe some in between where you've got someone who's running 4 or 5 or 10 different properties. In aggregate, it's a massive industry. It's bringing in, I know by Airbnb's estimate, through Airbnb alone, they brought in, I believe it was 23 billion rands worth of tourism income into the country in 2023. I stand to be corrected, but that's my memory of what they reported on. And that's excluding the other platforms like Booking.com and Lecaslap, etc. And there's thousands and thousands of listings. It's an industry which is believed to employ something in the order of 80 to 100,000 people locally, but that has very, very little voice. So essentially what we looked to do with a few other participants in the industry was to create a body that would represent the interests of the short-term rentals industry. And that is a body called SASTRA, South African Short-Term Rentals Association. I see Miguel Martins, who's one of the board members, is online and posting questions. Hi, Miguel. And essentially, that organization is something that we've created to represent all the stakeholders in the short-term rental industry, property management companies and property investors, as well as the platforms like your Airbnb and Booking.com, to give our industry a voice. I believe it's an important industry. I agree 100% with Jacques. We're not going back. This is something that tourists want. When people travel, there's a category of people who want this. And I know that some people out there say, well, you know, if you kill short-term rentals, people just move into hotels. They'll find another avenue to come and visit Cape Town. That is not my opinion. I believe that if someone's looking for that product, if it's not available here, they're going to go to Thailand or the Caribbean or Morocco or one of any other places. What tourism is it's a globally competitive market space. And yeah, the SASTRA has essentially been put in place. I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the industry to go to sastra.org.za. The regulation, it's still being defined. So lots of people are alluding to lots of different things around caps, this and that. The truth of the matter is that it has not yet been defined. And until it has been, there's very little to comment on. But I would encourage everyone with an interest in the industry to register at sastra.org.za, because that body, I think, is our best chance of interacting with the authorities to ensure that our voices are heard when it comes down to making the decisions around these laws.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for that, Richard. And I see the time is running away with us. So, and I think the way we can deal with it, thank you to the attendees for your questions. There's some really, really good questions here. And some of them have already been answered. So, and so a lot of them also investor type questions, that kind of thing. And for example, the Airbnb laws, we've touched on that. We've spoken about body corporates getting stricter on short-term rentals. We've kind of touched on that. Cape Town and other holiday type still experience extreme seasonality. I think that was dealt with quite nicely up front with Richard, where he said, certainly in winter, there's definitely there's a longer season of short-term rentals that are coming through. So, and then in Sastra, thanks for that. So the one I would like seems to be not touched on yet, and I think, Robin, it's one for you. And that's before we go into our final wrap with each one of you. So, Robin, maybe, and welcome also any one of the other panelists to join in if they would like to respond. The question is, can you give us an indication of requirements that investors might look at when searching for Airbnb or short-term rentals? What are the requirements that may be an obstacle to the seller or landlord? And I welcome many of the other, but Robin, let's go over to you in terms of response to that question.
Yeah, I'll keep this one short and sweet, Neil. I have basically three. The first one is, can I do Airbnb in this building or apartment? So if the body corporate says no, that's a big obstacle. Please don't go and buy a property or an apartment. Think you're starting, and then the body corporate comes and says, hey, you didn't read our body corporate rules. It says no short-term letting, and then you're stuck, even if you're renting it. So rule number one, check that it's permissible in that unit or that neighborhood or complex. Second one is, can the check-in be automated? And what I mean by that is it does not require someone to meet the guest to hand over keys. That could be an option if you want to, a value add, even though that costs a lot of money and actually decreases flexibility for the guest. We are finding more and more people want flexibility of check-in. They don't want to have to stress about meeting someone at a specific time because there are delays and it becomes a whole lot of things. And it's expensive. You have to pay someone to wait there to hand over keys if it's that kind of apartment. So an ability to automate. The guest can come, find the keys, use access codes, whatever it is to make sure they can, check in of their own accord. And I think then the third thing is, make sure you've got systems, because your profitability comes not so much in just the amount of money that's coming in, but in you making sure you keep as much of that money coming in instead of being paid off in inefficient expenses or inefficient processes. So your ability to systemize and just really make this efficient means your yields are going to skyrocket. And those are the three things just from point blank that are absolutely necessary.
Excellent. I think it's a good way to finish. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go round table to our panelists, and I'm going to ask you just to give maybe a minute, your final wrap, your final thoughts, maybe leave our audience, with something that they can use, maybe give them some ideas, something which they could implement, something which they can take away and say, wow, that's what I'm going to do. And Jacques, if we could start off with you, if that's okay, and then we'll go to Richard and then Robin.
Yeah, I think there's just Rich spoke about how tech heavy the industry is. I think there's such amazing, really low cost tech available. There's software like AirDNA, which does, real detailed scraping and analysis of how the properties perform. But I think for me, what the biggest net outcome of all this wonderful technology that's linked to this industry is making sure that you do proper cash planning. What we've just seen is when we see our customers really struggle, it's that their cash planning has been a little bit light and a little bit poor, and they find themselves not able to cope with seasonality in their pricing model and kind of really struggling through the winters and then being forced to make poor decisions, whether that's lowering the quality of your guests or kind of having to sell in a pressurized situation. We always work with any of our investor buyers to try and add a bit of pragmatism and a bit of fail-safes into their cash flow planning.
Great stuff. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you, Jacques. That's Jacques van Emden, CEO of Block. Just launched the 20th development there in De Waterkant. So thank you for joining us today, Jacques. And then, of course, last but let's get into Richard. Richard, do you want to give us your final thoughts, your parting shot? And then, Robin, we'll move over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Neil. What I'd say to anyone who's considering investing in this segment, I'd say short-term rentals, it's a real estate asset, but it's a hospitality business. So when you're making your decisions, think about that hospitality. How am I going to deliver the service that the guest needs? Because that service ultimately is what is the primary driver of your yields. It's making sure that guests love their stay and want to come back.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. That's Richard Marshall. He's the founder and managing director of Knox, Cape Town. All right, so last but not least, Robin, your final thoughts that you could leave the audience here today before we exit. It's been a great discussion, I must say, really been engaging. A lot of good questions. Your final thoughts here, Robin.
Yeah, I'm going to speak straight to the investor person who is listening to this. From the perspective of maybe 10 years ago, the belief was that we needed to get into property investing because who's going to look after us when we retire? We need to have some form of a retirement plan, and property investing gave us that tool if we started early enough. Short-term rentals allows us to fire our bosses and actually allows us at a lot earlier to exit that rat race and start to determine life on different terms, on our terms. And I know that personally from my side, but from the clients and people on this call as well who are listening, I know they have started their short-term rental business through rental arbitrage, have generated enough income from just renting properties that supersede what they were earning through employment, and they fired their bosses and have gone off and are now generating not only their monthly income, but are starting to generate wealth as they start to expand it into different ways. So for me, the investor who's listening to this, it's definitely here to stay. It's an asset category, both from the rental and long-term ownership model that literally will change investors' lives.
Excellent. That's Robin Booth. He's a seasoned short-term rental investor and also educator. Great having you. And Jacques van Enden, he's the CEO of Block, and Richard Marshall of Knox, Cape Town, founder, managing director. So if you'd like to connect with any one of our speakers today, you can do that directly. If you can't get to them directly, you can come to REI. You can email us info@rei.co.za, or you can click on the link over there. Don't forget to join us. We don't have a webinar next week, or 2 live events outside of in Johannesburg, so there's no webinar next week. So, but it's going to be Thursday, back to our Thursday slot, 12th of June, 12 o'clock, balancing growth, affordability, and risk in South Africa's evolving affordable residential property market. There is a link below you, or you can just go to the rei.co.za website. So finally, a sincere thank you to you, the audience, today for taking the time to join us. Your participation and engagement certainly makes these sessions worthwhile. We hope you leave today fresh insights, new ideas, and the confidence to take your investment strategy to the next level. So until next time, until the 12th of June, this is Neil Peterson from REI wishing you success and smart investing. And alongside our panelists, Jacques, Robin, and Richard, goodbye and take care, everybody. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.